Get out. Now. A little girl walked into the millionaire's office. 1 minute later, the alarm saved his life. The office tower was almost empty by the time Ethan Rowan leaned back in his chair and loosened his tie. Night pressed against the panoramic windows, turning the city below into a scatter of distant lights that felt far removed from him. He had built this view for himself years ago, floor by floor, decision by decision, and tonight it brought no comfort. Papers lay spread across his desk, numbers circled in red, names underlined, all of them reminders that trust was fragile and success even more so. Ethan rubbed his eyes and glanced at the clock. It was late, far later than he had planned, but going home felt pointless when tomorrow threatened to tear apart everything he had worked for. He stood up and walked slowly across the office, his footsteps echoing softly against glass and polished stone. The quiet was absolute, the kind that made even his breathing sound too loud. He liked control, liked knowing every detail, yet tonight something felt off, though he couldn't say why. In the hallway outside his office, the cleaning crew was finishing their rounds. The muted hum of a vacuum faded, replaced by the soft swish of a mop against the floor. Ethan barely noticed. People like him were used to work happening around them, unseen and unacknowledged. He returned to his desk, picked up a document, then set it down again, his focus slipping. A faint scent reached him then. So light it could have been imagined. Something unfamiliar, sharp at the back of his throat. Ethan paused, frowning slightly, and took another breath. The smell was still there, subtle but unsettling, as if the air itself had changed without permission. He stood again and moved toward the window, opening it just a crack before remembering the building's sealed ventilation system. The city air didn't reach him. The smell didn't fade. Ethan exhaled slowly, irritation creeping in. Stress, he told himself. Long hours had a way of playing tricks on the mind. He turned back toward his desk, unaware that down the hall, a small figure had stopped moving altogether. Emily, the daughter of one of the cleaners, stood frozen near the open door of a neighboring office. She was 8 years old, blonde hair falling loosely over her shoulders, blue eyes suddenly wide with confusion and fear. She had been drawing quietly on the floor, waiting for her mother to finish, when the smell reached her too. Unlike Ethan, she didn't try to explain it away. Her stomach tightened, instinct screaming louder than reason. She had smelled something like this once before, years ago, when a stove had been left on at home. Back then, her mother had rushed them outside, panic sharp in her voice. Danger, her mind whispered. Emily looked down the hallway toward Ethan's office. The door was still open. The lights were on. He was still inside. For a second, she hesitated, her heart pounding hard enough to hurt. Adults didn't like being interrupted. Especially important ones. Especially late at night. But the smell grew stronger, and with it, her fear. Without fully understanding why, Emily stood up. And began to run. Emily's footsteps were almost silent against the carpeted hallway, but to her they sounded unbearably loud. Her heart hammered in her chest as she ran, clutching the hem of her pink dress with one hand to keep from tripping. The smell followed her, growing heavier with every step, no longer faint or uncertain, but sharp enough to sting her nose and make her eyes water. She had stopped breathing deeply without even realizing it, taking short, careful breaths the way her mother once had taught her. As she passed one of the offices, she saw something that made her slow down abruptly. The door to a small technical room was slightly open. Inside, a panel in the wall stood ajar, wires and metal exposed. Emily didn't understand what it was for, but she knew it wasn't supposed to look like that. Just moments earlier, she had seen a man leaving that room. He had been tall, wearing an expensive suit, walking quickly with his head lowered, as if he didn't want to be noticed. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Adults came and went all the time. Now the memory returned with frightening clarity. Emily stopped for a split second, her mind racing. She looked back down the hallway. Ethan's office was still lit, the glass walls glowing warmly against the darkness of the empty floor. He was still there. He didn't know. The thought made her chest tighten painfully. She wanted to run to her mother first, to grab her hand and let an adult take over. That would have been easier. Safer. But her mother was at the far end of the floor, and every second felt suddenly precious, fragile, as if time itself were thinning. Emily swallowed hard and forced her legs to move again. Inside Ethan's office, he had begun to feel unsteady. The irritation he had tried to ignore was turning into something heavier, a dull pressure behind his eyes. He loosened his tie further and leaned one hand on the desk, breathing slowly, trying to ground himself. The smell was stronger now, undeniable, but his thoughts were sluggish, as if his mind were wrapped in cotton. "Get it together," he muttered to himself, embarrassed by his own weakness. At that moment, Emily reached the door. She stood there for half a second, small and trembling, staring at a man who looked powerful and untouchable, someone she had been taught not to interrupt. The contrast between them felt overwhelming. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a flawless blue suit. She was just a child, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. But the smell was everywhere now. Emily took a sharp breath and stepped inside. "Sir," she tried to say, but her voice came out thin and almost disappeared in the large room. Panic surged through her, and suddenly fear turned into urgency, raw and uncontrollable. "You have to leave," she said louder, her voice cracking. "Now." Ethan turned toward her in surprise, irritation flickering across his face. "What are you doing here?" he asked, already taking a step forward. "This is not." He stopped mid-sentence. The room tilted slightly. A wave of dizziness rolled through him, stronger than before, stealing the rest of his words. He pressed his hand harder against the desk, blinking, trying to focus on the small girl standing in front of him, her blue eyes wide with terror. "You'll suffocate," Emily said, the words tumbling out now, unstoppable. "Please. We have to go. Right now." For the first time, Ethan noticed how pale she looked, how shallow her breathing was, how the fear in her eyes didn't resemble childish imagination but something far more real. A cold realization cut through the fog in his head. He took one careful breath, then another, and understood. This wasn't stress. This wasn't exhaustion. Something was very wrong. Ethan tried to straighten up, but his body didn't respond the way it normally did. His legs felt heavy, as if the floor were pulling him down, and the pressure behind his eyes sharpened into a dull ache that made it hard to think clearly. He took another breath and immediately regretted it. The air burned faintly in his lungs, leaving a metallic taste at the back of his throat. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though even to his own ears his voice sounded distant and strained. He glanced toward the open door, then back at the girl, trying to piece together what was happening. "You shouldn't be in here." Emily shook her head hard, her blonde hair brushing her cheeks. She stepped closer without thinking, driven by fear stronger than her hesitation. Up close, she could see that his face had lost its healthy color, that a thin sheen of sweat had appeared along his temples. "I smelled it," she said quickly, words spilling over each other. "It's bad. Someone opened something in the wall. I saw him do it. He turned something and left." Ethan frowned, struggling to keep his focus. "Who?" he asked. "What are you saying?" "The man in the suit," Emily replied, pointing vaguely toward the hallway. "He came out of the small room and closed the door really fast. And then the air changed. As she spoke, the smell grew stronger, no longer subtle or ignorable. It filled the office completely now, pressing in from every direction. Ethan's heart began to race, not from panic yet, but from the sudden clarity breaking through the haze in his mind. He had grown up learning about systems, about buildings, about how things were designed to function safely and quietly. Gas lines. Ventilation. Emergency protocols. And how easily they could be abused. He staggered slightly, catching himself on the edge of the desk. Emily reached out instinctively and grabbed his sleeve, her small fingers tightening in the expensive fabric. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "You have to go. Now." The urgency in her voice cut through the last of his doubt. This was not a child inventing danger. This was a child recognizing it faster than he had. Ethan nodded once, the motion slow and deliberate. "All right," he said. "You're right." He moved toward the door, but after only a few steps the dizziness worsened, forcing him to stop. The world tilted again, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, afraid that if he didn't, he might collapse. Emily felt panic surge through her chest. "Don't stop," she said, pulling gently but insistently. "We're almost out." She guided him as best she could, her small body pressed close to his side, doing everything she could to keep him moving. The hallway outside felt colder, emptier, but the smell lingered there too, creeping outward from the office like an invisible threat. As they moved, a sharp sound pierced the air. The alarm. Red lights began to flash along the ceiling, and a loud warning signal echoed through the floor, breaking the heavy silence that had dominated the night. Emergency systems kicked in, vents shifting, doors unlocking automatically. Somewhere nearby, voices rose in confusion. Ethan exhaled sharply, relief and fear colliding in his chest. "You triggered it," he said hoarsely. Emily shook her head. "I didn't," she replied. "It did it by itself." He understood immediately. The gas levels had crossed a threshold. The building had recognized the danger, even if he hadn't. Security guards appeared at the far end of the hallway, shouting instructions, directing people toward the stairs. One of them spotted Ethan and rushed forward. "Sir, are you all right?" the guard asked urgently. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked down at Emily, who was still gripping his sleeve, her knuckles white, her eyes wide but steady. "She saved my life," he said finally. The guard stared at the girl in disbelief, then moved quickly to support Ethan as they headed for the exit. Emily stayed close, refusing to let go until they reached the stairwell, where fresh air finally cut through the suffocating smell. As they descended together, the noise of alarms echoing above them, Ethan felt the full weight of what had almost happened settle over him. Someone had planned this carefully. Quietly. And if not for a child who trusted her instincts instead of her fear, he would never have made it out. Emily didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that the air felt easier to breathe now. And that she had done the right thing. The stairwell echoed with hurried footsteps and sharp voices as people were directed downward in tight lines, the red emergency lights washing everything in an unsettling glow. Ethan leaned heavily on the railing, his breath still shallow, each inhale a reminder of how close he had come to not breathing at all. Security stayed close, one guard speaking rapidly into a radio, relaying information about gas detection and a possible deliberate breach. Emily stayed beside Ethan, her hand still gripping his sleeve as if letting go might somehow undo what they had escaped. Only now, with the danger temporarily behind them, did her knees begin to tremble. The fear she had held back so fiercely finally reached the surface, and she swallowed hard, fighting the urge to cry. When they reached the ground floor, the doors burst open into cool night air. People spilled out onto the sidewalk, coughing, confused, frightened, but alive. Ethan stepped outside and immediately bent forward, hands on his knees, drawing in deep breaths as paramedics rushed toward him. Someone placed a blanket around his shoulders, another offered water, but he waved them off for a moment, his gaze searching for one small figure. Emily stood a few steps away, her pink dress wrinkled, her face pale, eyes still wide. Her mother had found her now, clutching her tightly, speaking rapidly in a mix of relief and panic. "Emily, what did you do?" her mother whispered, pulling her close. "You scared me to death." Emily didn't answer right away. She just pointed weakly toward Ethan. "He was going to get hurt," she said quietly. "I smelled it. I saw him turn it." Her mother froze, then looked at Ethan, realization slowly replacing confusion. Ethan straightened and walked over despite the paramedics' protests. He stopped in front of Emily and her mother, lowering himself slightly so he wasn't towering over the child who had just saved him. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice still rough but steady. "She came into my office and warned me. If she hadn't..." He stopped, the rest unnecessary. Emily's mother stared at him in disbelief. "She's just a child," she said softly. "She was supposed to be drawing." Ethan nodded. And yet she noticed what none of us did. Firefighters entered the building moments later, their equipment hissing softly as they moved inside. Security footage was already being pulled, and police officers arrived shortly after, cordoning off the area. Questions filled the air, overlapping and urgent. Ethan answered them all patiently, recounting what he remembered, then stepping aside to let Emily speak. She explained what she had seen with surprising clarity, her voice small but precise. The officers exchanged glances as she spoke, their expressions changing as the details aligned with what they were beginning to find inside. A man in an expensive suit had been caught on camera opening a service panel. A gas valve had been deliberately turned. It had not been an accident. As the night stretched on, Ethan sat in the back of an ambulance, finally allowing the medics to check his vitals. His hand still shook slightly, not from weakness now, but from the delayed realization of how fragile his life had been only minutes earlier. Through the open doors, he watched Emily sit on the curb beside her mother, wrapped in a blanket that nearly swallowed her small frame. She looked exhausted, drained, but unharmed. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, a weight settling in his chest that had nothing to do with the gas. He had trusted the wrong people. He had ignored the right ones. And a child had paid attention when he hadn't. That truth stayed with him as the sirens faded into the distance, louder and more lasting than the alarm that had saved his life. Morning came slowly, as if the city itself needed time to recover from the night before. Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the curtains still drawn, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold on the table beside him. Sleep had come in fragments, broken by flashes of memory, the sharp smell in the air, the sudden dizziness, the sound of Emily's voice cutting through his confusion with terrifying clarity. "Get out. Now." He pressed his fingers to his temple and exhaled. He had faced danger before, hostile negotiations, ruthless competitors, calculated risks, but this had been different. This had been quiet. Invisible. Designed to end everything without noise or witnesses. And it almost had. At the police station later that morning, the tone was no longer cautious or polite. It was precise. Focused. Footage from the building's internal cameras played on a large screen, frame by frame. Ethan watched in silence as the image of a familiar man appeared, moving confidently through the hallway late at night, opening the service panel with practiced ease, turning the valve, then leaving without a trace of hesitation. His business partner. The realization landed like a physical blow. Ethan didn't speak at first. He simply stared at the screen, watching trust unravel in real time. This was someone who had shared meals with him, laughed with him, planned futures alongside him. Someone he had defended when others doubted. He knew the building, one of the investigators said quietly. He knew your schedule. He knew exactly how long it would take for the gas to reach dangerous levels. Ethan nodded once, his jaw tight. He knew me, he replied. The confession came quickly after the arrest. Debts. Desperation. Fear of exposure. A belief that removing Ethan would solve everything. The word sounded hollow, stripped of meaning by the reality of what had nearly happened. When Ethan finally left the station, the world outside felt different. Sharper. Louder. Every breath felt deliberate now, precious in a way it had never been before. That afternoon, he asked to see Emily again. She was sitting in a small waiting room with her mother, her legs swinging nervously above the floor, clutching a stuffed toy someone had given her the night before. When she saw Ethan enter, she stiffened, unsure of what to expect. Adults rarely came back after emergencies. They usually moved on. Ethan approached slowly and knelt in front of her, lowering himself to her level. His blue eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You saved my life," he said finally, simply. Emily looked down at her hands. "I just smelled something bad," she replied. "I didn't want you to get hurt." "That was enough," Ethan said. "More than enough." Her mother watched silently, still trying to understand how her daughter had walked into a danger she herself hadn't noticed. Ethan turned to her next. "I owe you both more than I can say," he told her. "But more than gratitude, I owe you honesty. What happened was intentional. And your daughter stopped it." Emily's mother inhaled sharply, one hand flying to her mouth. She pulled Emily closer without realizing it, fear and pride mixing painfully in her chest. Ethan stood, his expression firm now, resolved in a way that surprised even him. "This won't end with an arrest," he said. "I won't let it. Not after this." As he left the building, Ethan felt something shift inside him. The man who had walked into that office the night before believed control came from power and preparation. The man who walked out now understood something deeper. Sometimes survival comes from listening to the smallest voice in the room. And he had no intention of ever ignoring it again. The days that followed unfolded with a strange mix of urgency and stillness. The investigation moved quickly, driven by evidence that left little room for denial, yet Ethan felt as if he were watching it all from a distance. Meetings with lawyers, statements to authorities, security briefings that dissected every detail of the building systems filled his schedule, but his thoughts kept drifting back to one small moment that had changed everything. Emily's voice. He replayed it in his head again and again, not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them. A child who had trusted her instincts more than her fear. At the office, everything felt different. The same halls, the same glass walls, the same polished floors, yet the illusion of safety had been shattered. Ethan walked through the space slowly, escorted now, noticing details he had never paid attention to before. The service panel had been sealed and marked, warning signs posted, security protocols rewritten in bold, unmistakable language. But no system, he realized, could replace awareness. His former partner's arrest became public within days. Headlines spoke of betrayal, of attempted murder disguised as an accident. Ethan read none of them. He didn't need journalists to explain what trust felt like when it collapsed. He had lived it. Instead, he focused on Emily and her mother. He arranged for them to come to his office again, this time during the day, when sunlight filled the rooms and the air felt clean and safe. Emily walked beside her mother, her steps cautious, her eyes wide as she took in the space where everything had almost ended. She wore a pink dress again, freshly pressed, her blonde hair neatly brushed, but the seriousness in her blue eyes remained. Ethan met them at the door, not behind a desk, not above them, but standing at the same level. "I wanted to talk to you properly," he said. "Without alarms. Without fear." Emily nodded, gripping her mother's hand. They sat together in a smaller conference room, away from the glass walls. Ethan explained what would happen next in simple terms, choosing his words carefully so Emily could understand. The man who opened the gas valve would face consequences. The building was safe again. What she had done mattered, and it would not be forgotten. Emily listened quietly, then asked a question that surprised him. "Will you still work late?" she asked. Ethan paused. "Not like before," he answered honestly. "I think I need to pay more attention to the people around me." She seemed to consider this, then nodded once, as if satisfied. Before they left, Ethan handed Emily a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, not long, not dramatic. Just a promise that he would support her education and her family, not as charity, but as gratitude and responsibility. He wanted her future to be safe, not defined by a single brave moment, but strengthened by it. Emily didn't fully understand the meaning of it yet, but she felt the sincerity behind his words. That evening, after they were gone, Ethan remained alone in the office, standing by the window as the city lights came on below. He breathed deeply, consciously, feeling the air fill his lungs without fear. He knew one thing with absolute clarity now. His life had been returned to him not by power, not by money, not by control, but by a child who refused to stay silent. And that truth would guide every decision he made from that moment on. Weeks passed, and with them came a kind of quiet transformation that Ethan had never experienced before. The noise of the scandal faded from the news, replaced by newer stories, but inside his world the echo of that night never truly disappeared. It followed him into meetings, into empty rooms, into the pauses between conversations, reminding him that survival had changed him in ways success never had. Emily returned to her routines, though nothing felt quite the same. She went to school in the mornings, did her homework at the small kitchen table in the evenings, and waited for her mother when work ran late. Yet she noticed how adults looked at her differently now, not with fear or doubt, but with a quiet respect that made her uncomfortable. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a child who had been very scared and had acted because she didn't know what else to do. One afternoon, Ethan invited Emily and her mother to a small gathering at the office, nothing public or grand, just a few people who needed to hear the truth from the right source. Security staff, building managers, and a handful of executives sat in the room, listening as Ethan spoke openly about what had happened. He didn't soften the facts or hide his own mistakes. He admitted how close he had come to ignoring the warning signs, how easily he had trusted the wrong person, and how a child had noticed what experienced adults had missed. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Emily's mother spoke, her voice trembling slightly as she thanked everyone for listening to her daughter. Emily sat beside her, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. She wished the attention would pass, wished people would stop talking about her as if she weren't there. Ethan noticed and gently shifted the focus away from her. "This isn't about praise," he said. "It's about learning. If we don't learn from this, then we've missed the point." After the meeting, as people filtered out, Ethan walked with Emily down the hallway. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and for the first time since the incident, the space felt calm rather than threatening. "You did something very difficult," he said quietly. "But I don't want it to define you." Emily looked up at him. "I just want things to be normal again," she admitted. Ethan smiled softly. Normal changes, he said. But that doesn't mean it gets worse. That evening, Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about his words. She realized she wasn't as afraid as she had been before. The memory still scared her, but it no longer controlled her. She had spoken up once, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had listened. Across the city, Ethan stood on his balcony, breathing in the night air. He thought about the kind of leader he wanted to be now, the kind of man who didn't just survive danger, but learned from it. He understood that power carried responsibility, not only to protect himself, but to protect those who might one day need a voice. Both of them, in their own quiet ways, were moving forward. Not unchanged, but stronger. The months that followed slowly reshaped everything, though not in ways that were immediately visible. Life moved forward, but it did so with a new awareness that neither Ethan nor Emily could ever fully set aside. The memory of that night did not fade into something distant or unreal. Instead, it settled quietly into who they were becoming. Ethan returned to the office after renovations were completed and safety systems fully upgraded. The space no longer felt like a fortress built on control, but like a place where people were meant to breathe freely, both literally and figuratively. He no longer shut himself away behind glass walls late into the night. He walked the floors, spoke with staff by name, and listened in ways he never had before. The power he once believed came from authority now felt different. It came from awareness, from presence, from understanding how fragile everything truly was. Emily's world grew wider, brighter, and safer. She began attending a better school, one where curiosity was encouraged and her sharp awareness was treated as a strength rather than something strange. She still walked beside her mother in the evening sometimes, still waited quietly when work ran late, but the weight of responsibility she had carried that night no longer pressed so heavily on her small shoulders. She was allowed to be a child again, without forgetting the courage she had found within herself. Ethan kept in touch, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Sometimes it was a short message asking how school was going. Sometimes it was an invitation to lunch with her mother, simple and unremarkable, the kind of moments that made trust feel normal instead of extraordinary. He never tried to turn Emily into a symbol or a story. He understood that what she had done deserved gratitude, not exploitation. One quiet evening, nearly a year after the incident, Ethan stood alone in his office with the windows open, the city air cool and clean as it flowed through the room. The lights were dim, the building calm. He took a deep breath and smiled to himself, remembering how close he had come to never feeling that simple relief again. Across the city, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She thought about how fear had once pushed her to run, and how that same fear had transformed into something else entirely. Not bravery as she had imagined it, loud and dramatic, but bravery that felt quiet and steady, like knowing when to speak even if your voice shakes. Neither of them would ever forget what happened. But neither of them was defined by it anymore. Life continued, imperfect and uncertain, but filled with possibility. And in that shared understanding, something gentle and enduring remained. Sometimes survival changes who you are. And sometimes, it teaches you how to truly live.